Hey everybody, this is Brian Aiello, and this is Mirage, speculating on speculative fiction. Today I am joined by Marcus Anderson. We are going to be discussing the Hugo award-winning author, Octavia E. Butler, a science fiction author. Marcus, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Glad
Man,
to
I
be
really
here.
appreciate you joining me here. This is your author. You picked her out. And I
Okay.
knew nothing about her prior to doing a little research, and she's a fascinating character. How did you get introduced to her as an author?
I was introduced to her, I would say, I think at this point it was probably 12 or 13 years ago. A friend of mine had, she just came up in conversation. We were speaking about novels and science fiction in particular. And actually the specific conversation we were having like dealt a lot with, Black people in science fiction.
Uh-huh.
And, both as characters in stories and as far as authors are concerned. And like my friend was basically like, "Oh, you have to check out Octavia Butler." So the first book that I picked up by her was Parable of the Sower,
Okay.
and it's that book is fascinating in that I feel that in many, not I feel, because I know other people have made this comparison as well, but it really is kind of eerie reading it through the lens of 2017 and the current madness we're experiencing, culturally and politically in America.
Yeah.
In that the story takes place in a dystopian future or near future, and just
Like
society
3 years from now, 2020s is when it's
right.
set, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And things are broken down, and basically the catalyst for the breakdown is just the blurring of the lines between corporate America and just our politics and everything. And it's obviously we're in a time where it's not a big reach to um just to draw that comparison about the idea of the lines being blurred between the corporate and for-profit one percenter world and our politics. And
Yeah, it's absolutely horrible the amount of ownership the 1% own. There's like
right,
95%, something horrible, some horrible number like that.
yeah,
Just to go back to a statement that you made already about her being an African American author,
right.
there are not many African American science fiction authors, and like in terms of what she's been able to accomplish and when she was able to accomplish it, can you think of somebody that marvels her success?
You mean like since or prior
At the
or
same
around the
time, I mean,
contemporaries?
like, maybe even nowadays. I mean, I'm
um
totally ignorant
what's
about
really
it.
Well, no, I mean, like that's a very fair question. It's a good point. What's really cool is I feel that she has inspired a lot of people, and not in a derivative manner. But I actually had an opportunity to speak to an author or a professor on another podcast, and she was I'm blanking on her name right now. But she was. It's going to come to me. Wait, hold on one second. I'm gonna look it up because it's gonna bother me if I
Sure,
don't.
no problem.
Okay. But anyway, while I'm looking it up, the just to kind of tell you what I'm talking about. The book was titled, I feel like it's Octavia's Brood, I believe. Um, and the whole idea behind it was a kind of anthology that specifically, highlighted Black women science fiction writers, and there was a large variety of subjects that they were writing about, but the idea was that it was told through their lens, which we'll get to later, but like lens is one of the things I find most fascinating about Octavia Butler, in that she tells these stories and you really see them through the eyes of her characters, which most of the time are Black women protagonists. And I don't know, she's really masterful at doing that, in a way that is very, very natural and it doesn't announce itself and say like, this is a Black story about a Black lady. She just
Yeah, that's what I noticed. I was listening to Speech Sounds,
mhm,
and she doesn't come out and say this is an African American protagonist and this is an African American character and these are African Americans on the bus. It was more like these are people doing people things, and it doesn't matter what they look like. It's just the story that I'm telling. Am I right about that?
right. So you're definitely right. I think in the sense of the of the construction of it. You know what I mean? But like I would say the only part of it where I would differ slightly is that she strikes this really cool balance in that she presents them and it is matter of fact, and it's just like for instance one book that I definitely want to speak about a little bit about later, which was the most recent one that I read, Fledgling,
Hmm.
which actually was I
That was
believe
her
her
last
last
one.
book.
Yeah, she died right after. That was
Right.
brutal.
Yeah, yeah, and just using that as an example before we really get into it, um, you know, you don't necessarily know her character's race until immediately, because a lot of times in mainstream fiction, one of the devices that happens is you usually understand that the protagonist is a white character unless it's explicitly stated, you know. And Octavia Butler, she kind of like eschews that whole idea in that she's basically like, no, this is a character. You're living with this character in this character's shoes, empathizing with them, seeing things through their perspective, and then it's just kind of like matter of factly throughout the discourse of the novel, you come across the information that they're Black. But the interesting thing, Fledgling is a perfect example. Shori, the main character's race, actually does become relevant. It doesn't appear to be relevant initially because you're in her head, and I always
Hmm.
say that, like, the interesting thing, obviously being a Black person myself, um when I'm just living my life and things are chill, you know what I'm saying, and like I'm not necessarily faced with the ways that I'm excluded from certain things or not necessarily represented in certain things. In those moments of my life, I'm not, sitting and thinking, man,
I'm
I'm
a Black
Black.
dude.
I'm like really
Yeah,
Black. Like,
I understand.
but and that's, I mean, it's funny because it's like you see things and people are like for instance, when I was in college, one of the big things was, a lot of very well-meaning students would say like, well, why does there need to be a Black student union? What if we had a white student union? And my response to that then and now is, in a lot of sense, the university that I went to, which was a wonderful place, but it was a predominantly white university, like that was the white student union. You know what I mean? And it's
Mhm.
kind of like a lot of times, I think what gets lost in the discussion in our society a lot of times is the need to at times make spaces for ourselves grows out of the fact that um it's so that there's always been a resistance in a lot of larger spaces to include us. You know what I
It's
mean? So
so
it's not
interesting, though, that horrible term white versus black. You know what I mean?
right.
Back in the day, it used to be Italian Americans had, Italian American clubs, and Germans had
Mhm.
German American clubs, and things like the Irish American clubs. And
Right.
now they're all lumped together in this category called white. You
Oh,
know what I
that's a
mean?
whole, yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I'm with you because like that's a whole other topic which I won't go too deep into, but it's like in a sense because yes, you just hit the nail on the head, right? Like,
Hmm.
what today people call like, oh, these are white people. What that essentially is, it was like a peace treaty in a sense, between like a lot of groups of people who didn't get along,
You're okay, I'm
who
okay, basically, and we're gonna keep all the
yeah,
other
like
ones out. All the brown people, they can sit over there or whatever, which
right,
is
right. You had a bunch of people who mistreated one another, who discriminated, like you said, Irish people, Italian people. There was all types of discrimination, but then it's like, but at least we're not them. And there was
Mhm.
also the idea that even during slavery, um, you had a lot of commiseration and collaboration between like poor white people and Black enslaved people. So and that was seen as a threat by the 1% of that time, you know. And so like that is largely where this, you know, weird peace treaty kind of came from, and this that furthered all this division. But you know, not to get too far off track, but like,
No, I think that is a
I
track, though.
think,
I mean, in terms of this
yeah,
woman,
yeah.
and I looked a little bit into her past too.
Mhm.
She was born to a house cleaner, or what do you ever call it? Now, a shoe shiner
Yeah,
dad,
her father shined shoes, and her mother was a maid. Yep.
and he died very young, 7 years old, which
Mhm.
is very close to the narrative of modern day African American people. But I mean, she saw the racism, and she was in a situation where Pasadena, I think, wasn't segregated, but at the same time
Mhm.
she was segregated because she was shy and had a little dyslexia or whatever, and
Right.
found herself reading. And I mean,
Yeah, yeah, no,
just
absolutely. And I mean, that's an interesting thing too. And I feel like it bears fruit in her writing, in the sense
yeah,
that, like, you know, she did witness discrimination. She witnessed her mother, you know, being treated unequally, like, you know, as a house cleaner, and kind of like having to enter through the black people exit
back door.
entrance, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And saw that, but she also grew up in a community that for that time was integrated and was diverse for that time. So it's interesting, and I think that the complexity and what's the word I'm looking for? But yeah, because just the kind of the way that her experience, you know, coming up, it was so many things at once. I think that really informed the stories that she would come to tell, and the perspective that she was able to bring to those stories. But
I'm not
yeah.
as educated on her bibliography as I'd like to be. But what I got from what I did read was that she is taking herself as a character and writing about her experiences. At least that's what it seemed like in Speech Sounds, and then looking at these other characters in these other books. They seem to mirror her in a way. I mean, grant she's writing science fiction, and she's not writing about
Right,
her world, but she's writing about herself and the experiences,
right.
potentially.
Yeah, like, it's she is, and I think, but I think she's even more so than that, because the the four books of hers that I'm most familiar with are, you know, Kindred, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, and Fledgling. And in those books, you know, they all deal with young black women, but even thinking about those stories, their experiences are very different, and, you know, their places in the world. So I think what she's able to do through these stories is, you know, tell these women's stories. And, you know, just coming back to the idea of lens that I was talking about,
Hmm.
she's able to, in this country where, like, you know, unfortunately a lot of times, we're not always able to, well, when I say we, I mean, like, I guess just larger society, however you want to phrase it, isn't
Hmm.
always able to put themselves in the shoes of marginalized people, in this case black women, or black people in general. And not even in the sense that, like, I'm saying, like, oh, everybody's racist, because there's a lot of well-meaning people who, that's not where they're coming from. They don't, you know, the old cliche of not having a racist bone in your body, which
It's
is a
not
silly
true, though, is
cliche,
it?
but whatever.
I mean, race is everywhere.
Was
So, I
that?
mean, everybody's probably a little bit racist, maybe a little bit
Well,
more
yeah, you know, in a sense,
than they
yeah.
let on.
But then again, it's like there. Well, yeah, and then there's the idea of, which I definitely believe, is that of, you know, racism being tied to power, and a power structure, as opposed to, now, you know, there's the idea of, like, prejudice and people not getting along.
Hmm.
But I do think that there's too much of a thing at times where, like, people really, you know, colloquially, like, look at racism as just kind of like, you know, people bumping heads. And you know, that's a whole other discussion. But
Yeah.
in the context of what I was talking about, she's able to, it's just a fact. Like, it's like, for me, even, like, as a black man, it's like lived experience. It's like I have this whole perspective, this whole life experience. And um a lot of people just aren't interested in it, you know. If it doesn't affect them, it's kind of inconvenient, you know, seeing past past the surface level. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I don't know, it's hard for America to reckon with race and its racial history. And
It's not a happy story. It's
right,
a sad
but
story. It's a bleak story.
but it's necessary. And as a matter of
Yeah.
fact, I was listening earlier today to a really, you know, great interview that Larry Wilmore had with Dan Rather. And Dan Rather just was like, you know, I don't even know how old Dan Rather is at this point, but he just was really,
70s, 80s.
yeah, but I mean, he was just really just dropping science. Like he was just, and it's cool because he's got so much life experience, and his obviously his career as a journalist, he's seen so many things from so many different perspectives. That being said, not every journalist has the perspective he has, but he, in the course of that discussion, they spoke about a lot of things. And one of the things that Dan Rather said is that is just what we're talking about. He said that, like, you know, race is so challenging. It's not a happy story, you know, and people just quite frankly run from it. But it's honestly one of the most pressing things, if not the most pressing things, that we need to deal with in this country. And I mean, I definitely firmly believe that, in the sense that inequality in general, like whether it's class, or, you know, or gender, or any other type of inequality, it basically all of our conflicts stem from that in one way or another. And, you know,
Mhm.
so, you know, aside from that,
Defense of what you have. This is
right,
me. This is my
right,
property. This is my yard. I'm keeping it away from you. You can't touch
right,
my wheat because it's mine. Don't touch my women. They're mine. Basically, that's the gist of, you know, you versus
right.
them or whatever. And for me,
Whether
when
or
I
not
think
you're
about
going
it,
for
that
those things or not, yeah.
yeah, it's the elitists thinking to themselves, okay, I'm going to knock the legs out of society and keep them against each other. The
Hmm.
poor white people versus the poor colored people, basically. And
Right.
if they're focused on themselves, they're not going to be focused on us because they're going to be too distracted with blah, blah, whatever the have you situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but that's the cool thing, that I think the opportunity that obviously art, literature, you know, which I mean, I think we spoke about in our last conversation, but like that these things present us. They present us with an opportunity, and what Octavia Butler is able to do through these stories, and the way that she just kind of matter of factly presents these characters living their lives. And, you know, like their race becomes relevant in the story when they run up against the world. But up until that point, they're, you know, they're people, and they're, you know, doing what they need to do to survive, or attain whatever goals happen to be the case in that given story. You know what I mean? But like
Mhm.
the but it's a little bit more complicated than um their race not being relevant, because it is relevant, but it's in a very nuanced manner. And honestly, like, it's a way that feels very true and very natural to how life is. You know, going back to my example of just how, like, in my day-to-day life, if things are cool and I'm not facing any situation, or, you know, nobody's messing with me at the moment, I'm not sitting around focused on my blackness. You know what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
a person.
Well, she didn't
um
come from a segregated community, though, either. Do you think that you would think that she would be more aware of the circumstances of her ethnicity while being
yeah,
surrounded by a bunch of other ethnic groups? You know what I mean?
right. So you're saying that, like, that being that she was in a community with a lot of different types of people, that would have highlighted for her difference. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah,
As an
yeah,
Italian
no,
American, I'm like, I'm Italian American. That's how I go through the world.
right.
You're this, that, and the other thing, but I'm an Italian American. You know, I was, you know, very not segregated community. It was a very, you know, Florida. I mean, what, old people.
Mhm.
It was very,
Right,
you know, homogenized, basically.
right. Yeah, yeah. And no, I think you're right. I think that her environment definitely, you know, fed her view of the world.
Well, I guess my point is that she managed to get past looking down at, or looking, you know, past her own nose, basically, and experience the world as a human being, is what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, that's the interesting thing, because I think we all, no matter who you are, obviously experience the world as human beings. I think that the world, smacks us in the face sometimes, depending on who you are, and like, we'll find ways to try to knock you down a peg. And maybe you might feel like you're fighting to have your humanity recognized, but like, I think in a sense we all experience the world as human beings. And I know for myself that I definitely do. You know what I mean? I'm like I said, like I'm Marcus when it comes down to it in my day-to-day life. But then it's like you run into situations. You have the experiences that other people can't necessarily relate to if they haven't walked in your shoes, where, you know, you have to. I mean, I'm 6'3". I'm 6'3" black man. Like, I
You
have
stick out.
dreadlocks. Yeah, I
You're
stick
walking down the
out, and
street,
like,
people are going to look at you and go, that dude's there or whatever.
right.
You're not going to
And
blend into the
yes, and
crowd.
like, right. And for most of my life, like dating back to childhood, I've had, different various times where I've had to various degrees have to, basically try to project, I'm not here to hurt you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Not necessarily because I'm trying to, placate people who fear me or don't respect me, but just for a matter of survival too, because like fear of fear has gotten, quite frankly, has gotten a lot of color killed over the years.
And
Um,
rattlesnakes don't strike people because they're vicious. They strike people because they're scared. I mean, that's basically the
right,
way the natural world works. If you
right.
make
But from
them
my
afraid of you,
perspective,
they're
it's
going to attack you to defend themselves, basically.
exactly. But it's like we live in a world where it's like, I can be attacked for unjustified fear.
Yeah. And that
So
happens
you know what I'm
often,
saying? Like,
especially
yeah,
nowadays.
no, absolutely, absolutely. So it's like, but I think that that's where like science fiction, as a genre, really provides an opportunity to shine a lens on things. And like with Octavia Butler, so Kindred, I don't know if you read about Kindred at all, but
I only know of it as the last book that she wrote, and she died really
yeah,
young,
well,
58.
Fledgling was the last one, but Kindred, that was a little bit earlier. But that book, the seeds of it basically were sown when she was in college, and she had an interaction with a peer in a class who he was black, and in the course of the discussion in class, he was basically being very critical of past generations of black people, and saying that, maybe that they didn't fight hard enough for their freedom, or their equality. And kind of like, he was, in his view, he was looking at them as subservient. And this was kind of her literary response. It wasn't even a response in the moment. It kind of just
Mhm.
got the idea kicking around in her head. And later she would go on to write Kindred. And basically,
Kindred
like,
to me is a very interesting sounding novel. It's about a time traveler, right? That goes back to pre-Civil War days.
right, but it's interesting because the protagonist, unlike in other time travel stories, like The Time Machine or something, the protagonist is by no means somebody who is setting out to go back in time. Matter of fact, the time travel which takes place in the story, I would argue it's more fantasy based than sci-fi, just in the fact that there isn't a machine, there's not an established science behind it. There's something more mystical about what draws her back in time. As the story progresses, we find out that like her being drawn back in time, like, I'm not going to give away too much for anyone who wants to read it, but like we find out that her being drawn back in time is directly tied to a young man who is the son of the guy who owns this plantation, that she's drawn back to. And there's a connection between them, which, you'll just have to read the book to find out. But basically, um, you know, what Octavia Butler is able to do through this story is like, examine, because Dana, the main character, who is a Black woman, she comes from 1976. She's in the United States in 1976. Her husband is a white man, and they have a good relationship, and things are good. She is, inexplicably pulled back through time very early in the story, and it's funny because it's kind of like there's an age old joke, with Black people. I've certainly made it myself that time travel, going back, definitely would not necessarily be the best thing for us, like
Yeah.
in a lot of senses. You know what I mean? And that's essentially is kind of the premise of the story. And Dana, 2017 or 1976 America, it was by any means like ideal, um, for Black people, but as Dana's drawn back quickly, she's aware, that there is an ever-present danger in the time she's going back to, but she's still like, there's still just this culture shock, and she kind of she's accustomed to having somewhat of a voice, and like that voice that she has, that she's accustomed to having, is just, it's dangerous in those times. And I think what the novel is really able to do is, number one, it operates, to me, it largely, both as maybe a fantasy novel, a period piece, and I would argue like a horror story in a lot of ways. Like there's
Mm,
a definite, obviously not like a Freddy Krueger horror, but something that's more effective and more visceral, in the sense that, like, you know, we know the history, and there's enough information about the on the ground lived experience about the enslaved people who, she becomes enmeshed with, in order to survive. And there's she's basically, a woman who's accustomed to not being enslaved, obviously, but like,
mhm.
due to her skin color, she is essentially automatically a slave when she goes back there. And the
Or
things that she
or an
needs.
escape slave, right? Or
Right.
a member of a non-community. I mean, at that point, prior to the Civil War, you're talking about a group of people that probably weren't really given the vote. I'm not even sure how
No, oh no, no,
Douglas
no.
got into the
Yeah,
Congress.
this was before that, definitely. Yes. And that's the thing, and it really highlights how much the day-to-day experiences of people, it doesn't matter how smart you were, it doesn't matter how, obviously, knowing how to read was dangerous back then. It was a thing you had to keep secret or you could die. Like, and so, imagine this college educated woman from 1976 coming back, as the characters in the book would frequently comment, like talking funny, or, quote unquote, speaking white. It's like there's inherent danger just in that, in the idea of her expressing herself, period.
Oh, that's fascinating. Speaking white back then would have been what? I mean, in terms of language, what were
Mhm.
slaves speaking? Obviously English, but it was mixed with some kind of what? Do you
Yeah, I
know?
mean, yeah, well, I think the idea, then and now, unfortunately, is that kind of, basically, it wasn't even about your language so much as what language you were speaking. Like, the slaves could be speaking English, but it's more like, the
Dialectical or
diction.
something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. The diction and the how much you articulated, and those types of things were what were and, are perceived as speaking white, at times. And but definitely more so back then, because it
Yeah.
was, like I said, if you're living in a time where there was a brutal, um effort to ensure that, like, slaves were literally not even allowed to learn to read. And like I said, like, it could cost you your life if you did learn to read. Just imagine what, a writer from, the 20th century, a college educated writer coming back, with her experiences and her way of interacting with the world. Imagine how that would obviously come across. So,
Yeah.
throughout the course of the story, she's forced to fit in to whatever extent is necessary for survival, and in a lot of time travel stories that I think we're accustomed to, we the main character is trying to change something, right? Like they're trying to like, bring about some type of change in the past in order to maybe affect something in the future. But honestly, Dana's experience is there's such a desperate moment to moment scramble for survival that's happening, that that's far from the case. Like, you know what I mean? Like her mission isn't to change time. And
Her
again,
mission is
not
to
to give away.
survive, basically.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And not to give away too much, but like at a certain point, like her, the way the time travel affects her, she can take things back that she's touching at the time. So at one point, like her husband, who is Kevin, who is a white man, like he's brought back in time too. And obviously that creates a whole other dynamic, right? Because it's like the way that the world interacts with him back then is different from the way it does with her. And he actually ends up getting stuck there for a while, and she's pulled back without him at one point. And so it's really fascinating the way that this affects them separately and individually. And I just think that that's one of the, I'm obviously selling Octavia Butler pretty hard because I think she's a genius, but I think that that's one of the things that she does really well is
Yeah.
she's able to just interrogate these aspects of our society and our world, but do it in a very just natural manner. It's like she's not it doesn't feel like she's hitting you over the head with it. It's more like, I'm telling you a really good story, but like because of the fascinating way that her mind works and the premises that she comes up with, and the the ways that she's able to subtly kind of just juxtapose these characters and these power dynamics, and um and the way identity kind of clashes into these narratives. Like she's able to really like shine a light on just the things that are a part of our everyday like life and society but aren't necessarily spoken about. She's able to do that really masterfully and kind of interrogate those ideas in a way that just feels really natural and natural to the story.
Where did she get that from? It's almost like a magical gift, isn't it? And she
Yeah.
wasn't like hanging out with a bunch of people either. According to her own words, she's basically a hermit, living alone, trying to avoid as much social interaction as she possibly can.
Right. No, she was a nerd, but and she kind of was kind of like, an outlier, and she wasn't, the life of the party. And I think that, as unpleasant as that might have been for her, I think that we were better off for it with the just the jewels that she was able to give to us. And yeah, like I don't know. I think she's
I
awesome.
was watching a Charlie Rose interview with her, and it was painful to start out. It was like,
Mhm.
when a chain falls off a bicycle, it's like wasn't catching.
Right.
They seemed to be at each other's throat for the first 5 minutes or so, and it was like watching Charlie Rose kind of struggle to get her to kind of relax into the conversation flow and
Mm.
not be too nervous. I mean, she was not going to say angry, but she was like she was nervous and agitated.
Right.
I
Right.
wonder if there's any kind of study about her mental situation. I know she suffered from depression at the end. Was
Right.
there any indication that she was mentally ill, to use more of a generic
You know,
term?
not to my knowledge. I mean, that's not to say that that wasn't the case, because obviously, like I think a lot of creative people do definitely have their struggles with mental illness,
Mhm.
but not to my knowledge. That I'm definitely familiar with a lot of her work and a lot of her story, but I don't necessarily know if that was the case. I do know depression, in the sense of depression. Yes, I mean I know she dealt with that, but I don't know how much further it went.
That's just fascinating. This is not her only slave narrative, though, right? Or is that the right term to use in terms of writing
Um,
about
as
pre-Civil War
far as far as
fiction?
as far as I know, I mean, I guess there could have been another one. As far as I know, Kindred is the one that I know of. Like the other books I read, like Fledgling is a contemporary book. It takes place like post 2000. And then yeah, like the parable books, they deal with like you mentioned our time now, but back then it was the future. So
And
I
you
mean
read
there
Parable,
could
right?
have been one.
You
Yeah, I
read
read
that
parable.
series,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It was,
Go into detail a
and
little bit about.
unfortunately, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please continue.
Oh no, no. All I was gonna say just real quick was that unfortunately, like Parable was meant to be a trilogy, and when she, like you mentioned, her untimely death in 2006, she was about to get to work on the third book, or maybe had just started it. I can't remember. She either had just started the third book or was preparing to write the third book at the time that she passed
What I
away.
read, she was having a hard time getting into the third one. She was
Right,
suffering from immense writer's
right.
block, and she decided she wanted to write something light, and that's when she wrote
Yeah,
Legend,
yeah, yeah,
and then died.
yeah. Yeah, and it's obviously really sad and unfortunate, just as far as like a human being passing away, period. But it's also it is sad, and I think
Yeah, she
that
should still be here. I mean, she was only 58 then. I mean, we're talking 12
right,
years ago. She pushing 70, still
yeah,
putting work out into the world instead of, daisies out of the ground, not to be
yeah,
crass, but it's
yeah.
unfortunate. And I wonder if her anti-socialism or whatever was affecting her life prevented her from taking care of herself, going to the doctor or something like that. I mean,
It
there's
yeah, it's possible. I mean, myself as an artist, being I've definitely recently just been like, man, I got to get more sleep. It's just those little things, and I'm aware of the traps that can happen for creative people. Kind of being lost in the world of their creativity and the struggles that might come along with it, and
It's
so
funny.
I
Yeah, I
don't
was
know.
thinking about Jack London too, recently because he died young. And one of the reasons they say he died was overworking himself. And I used to think back in the day, how did Jack London overwork himself? He was a freaking writer. You sit
Mm,
at a desk, you type on a keyboard, but with a family and whatnot, I wake up at
yeah,
like
yeah.
2 o'clock in the morning to get stuff done.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. And there's actually I was listening to a podcast that's where it's basically a podcast of three creators, three ladies. It's called Dirty Old Ladies, but they speak about like the process of creating comics and you know just what goes into it, what their experiences have been. There's a lot of advice. And there was one episode recently that really struck a chord with me because, one of the hosts was basically speaking about the idea that is kind of BS. The whole idea that like artists and writers and creators, we have to like struggle. And you know what I mean? Like we have to like have these tragic stories and that taking care of ourselves is important, and like which goes back to what you were saying, that like Octavia Butler should be here in her 70s and just blessing us with the things that come out of her mind, you know what I mean? And like so I do think that in general, like for creative people, there are, and obviously not to project and say that like Octavia Butler was buying into the idea that you know artists and writers and creators have to have lives of pure struggle, but like I do think that that is a thing to be aware of, and I think it's a thing that befalls a lot of creative people, unfortunately.
I think you spoke of it already. When she was born in an odd place in Pasadena,
Mhm,
in a a racially mixed area, but still treated like kind of a subservient class of people. Her mom was treated like the help, had to walk in the
mhm,
back door. Her dad died at 7 as a shoe shine dude. I mean, these aren't like noble professions. They're hard, and then as she's growing up, she has to work all these horrible jobs so that she can wake up at 2 o'clock in the
mhm.
morning and throw her words into a typewriter.
Right,
I mean, we're talking about the math works out to where she never felt like she belonged. According to her own words, she always felt ugly. She always
mhm,
felt stupid. She always felt out of place. And she buried herself into literature trying to, find some happiness. And,
right,
that's the fortunate thing. That's the sad thing as well, is that the reading and the writing, the thing that she gave back to the world is how she separated herself from the world. She put a
right.
divider up between, everybody else and her. so she could feel a little bit more comfortable in her own skin.
Yeah.
That to me is amazing. I mean, that's sad. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, I mean, ironic. I mean, it's everything that you don't want to say, because this poor human being at the end of her life, 58 years old, she suffered forever
Mhm.
with that problem that she had. She was never comfortable.
Right.
I don't think. I mean, you
Well,
can only
no,
speculate,
absolutely.
right?
Right, right. No, but I think you're right, and I think, and that's definitely my understanding of where she was coming from, and even listening to you say that, as you were saying it, I was just thinking about all the ways in these books that she takes these black women characters who, like you mentioned, like she identifies with, or in some ways, because for all of us, right, like our characters, even if it's a character that's told whose life is the antithesis of our own, usually elements of ourselves find their way into our stories. And Fledgling in particular, I can definitely use that as an example. The main character of Fledgling is, well, just so a super quick, before I get to my example, a super quick just synopsis of what the book is. Fledgling is a book about a young girl, or seemingly a young girl, who's uh we learn later on is a 53-year-old vampire, and the vampire and the vampire mythology that like Octavia Butler weaves in this book is totally different from the vampire stories that I think we're accustomed to. And to be quite honest, it's like my favorite vampire story ever. um and I think that's even what I might have been speaking about when you and I first talked about her a while back. But in the story, this protagonist, she is a person who is out of place in many ways. When we enter the story with her, she's not. I'm not giving away too much. But when we enter the story
Give
with
away it
her,
all, my friend. If they're tuning into this podcast, it's because they know Octavia Butler and they're excited to hear more
okay,
about
all right,
her.
cool, cool. I will, but I'll make sure I don't spoil everything. But essentially, like at the opening of the story, the main character Shori, who she doesn't even know her own name at the beginning of the story because she is waking up from a terrible tragedy that she barely survived, and it was a violent act that left her with memory loss, like severe memory loss. Like she can function now, her mind works fine now, but she just is there's like a wall, like she can't see past this moment when she wakes up literally at the beginning of the book. And there's and also the book is told in first person. So, and like I said, Octavia Butler is really masterful at showing us the world through her protagonist's shoes, and through their view and through their lens. And we see the world through Shori's eyes, and it's like we're the fledgling in this sense because we're relearning the world through her as she relearns it. Obviously, dramatic irony, we're aware of certain things about the world and the way things work, but we don't know everything. We certainly don't know about her world and her world as a vampire. But as the story progresses, she's a really sympathetic character. And she obviously faces like a lot throughout the story. Some of it is situational, and you definitely find out that within their vampire society that she comes from, that there definitely was racism played a large role in the things that happened to her. Hashtag not all vampires are racist, but like, obviously there's good people. There were good people within, and people who looked out for her. But a lot transpires in the story. And much like Kindred and some of the other books I talked about, I would have a hard time pinning this book just to one genre. I mean, I definitely, science fiction is in there, but there's so much she's able to do. There's a strong element of mystery, as she's trying to figure out the world, figure out what the threat is, and in a different way. This story also kind of is able to do a lot of what Kindred was able to do, in the way that I was describing how Kindred operates on a level as a horror story,
Hmm.
in the sense that like, just think about any of us, right? If like everything we know that we've learned over our years on this earth about, just operating in the world, how to stay safe, what to look out for. Imagine if like all of that was erased, you know what I mean? And you're bumping into people who know more about you than you do. You know what I mean? So it's like, for us as the reader going along with her on this journey, it's like every person she bumps into, you're really wondering like, all right, well, is this person really who they claim to be? Like, what are their motivations? Like, are they, I don't know, like, are they somebody that was one of the people that hurt her and her family before the beginning of the story, and she would have no way of knowing that. She would have no way of knowing that that person's a threat. So there is this strong suspense element throughout the story. But I feel like I had a reason why I brought the story up, but I feel like I got so into just like talking about all the things I like about it.
I
What was
mean, I think one of the reasons that you brought it up was that it does mirror her situation, right? I mean, we're talking about
right?
somebody
That's
who
what it
has
was.
it kind of,
Yes,
she has memory issues, she has brain
yes,
issues. I
yes.
do find this mythology though really interesting. What is it? The vampire venom extends their life not indefinitely, but
Yeah, well,
it makes them more immune and to diseases and stuff like that.
well, for the humans that they interact with, and it's kind of cool because it's like they have, I think in a lot of vampire stories that we're familiar with, it's like the vampire bites people, and if the person bites them back, then they might become a vampire too. But it's not quite that simple. In their, I kind of don't want to give it away because I feel like that's a big thrill of the book is learning as you go along. But there essentially there is there's like a symbiotic coexistence between the vampires and the humans that they feed off of, or you know what I mean. And so there's a human vampire society in a sense that's happening like right outside of the margins of our society, you know what I mean, like right under our noses that we don't necessarily know about or see. So in a lot of ways, this book also really deals with like the ideas of maybe politics or just hierarchies and societies because they do have their own world within our world, and there's overlap in the ways that, like I said, there's discrimination in their world, but even the discrimination doesn't necessarily take the same shape that it does. Um, but then in a lot of ways it does mirror. So I don't, she's able to like really, um it's a really complex story that at the same time, has a certain not simplicity, but like it's an easy read in the sense that you just want to keep going, you know what I'm saying? But like there's a lot
Yeah.
happening within that.
Well, that's what she said she did. She wrote it as like a lark. She's like, I want to write something soft and cuddly. She wrote
Mhm.
about vampires. Um,
Right, right.
excuse me one sec.
Yep.
Getting over a chest cold. A question occurred to me.
Mhm.
Do you think Octavia Butler is a for us by us writer? Do you think she's writing for the African American community, or do you think she's writing for everybody?
I think both. And in that, I mean, that's not a diplomatic answer. In what I mean by that is I think that she is very aware through her well, just what we've been speaking about a lot, right? Like we've been speaking about the fact that she had this dual existence, which in a lot of ways, when I mention it, reminds me of the idea that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about like the ideas of dual consciousness that Black people have to use in order to operate in America, being that like, we are human beings, we know we're human beings and everything, but then like America views us in another way. So it's kind of like there's this idea of these two consciousness that we, have to inhabit in traversing the world. And I think that for Octavia Butler, you can see where she's clearly made it a part of her mission to really center Black women in her stories. Not as side characters like in most movies and stories and everything. A lot of times you're quote unquote lucky if your Black woman character is a side character or a best friend or
Yeah.
whoever, but like she
A racial
centers.
caricature of what a black woman is, basically, not a
Absolutely
individual.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she made a very conscious decision to center these characters, and really, and a lot of times, I don't think every one of her books is first person, but she definitely employed a first person narrative quite a bit. Like Fledgling, she did. In Kindred, she did. I think Parable. It's been a while since I read Parable. I can't remember if it was first person, but either way, like she really centers it, and you see the world through these women's shoes, and she's able to really masterfully allow these women to be human beings. They're not the ones that are like, focused on race. It's the world around them, or maybe some of the individuals that they interact
That
with.
just that's exactly what you were talking about in the very beginning of the conversation. That it's
Right,
not you
right. And
focused on race, and you're not focused on who you are racially. You're focused on who you are as a person, and then the world reflects back onto you this thing called race.
right, right, absolutely. So in that sense, like I think she's definitely writing for us, proverbially, in the sense that that's been her experience, and I think that it's important to her to voice that experience. But then beyond that, like I think she's absolutely writing for everyone because of and I think not only is she writing for everyone, but I think that if people really pay attention to her work, I think that people outside of the experience of, people who aren't black could learn a lot. You know what I mean? Because I think that um being told a straight there's a real quick anecdote I'll tell, but I remember for myself as an artist, like in college, at one time, there was a scholarship competition every year, and it was called the Rosa Parks competition, and the idea of it essentially was to um create a piece of art or writing or something that embodied the ideas of just the ideas of positive, cultural plurality, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I wrote this piece, and drew something that accompanied it, and it was entitled "Womb to the Tomb," and the idea was about the fact that, like, children are born without bias and without hate in their heart and division, et cetera, but they're taught those things by the world. And so long story short, there was I won. I was one of the winners of the competition that year, and I had to present the poem in the campus center at this event, and it just happened to take place before this art history class I was taking at the time. Now, the art history class I was taking was a class that it dealt a lot with like 20th century art history, so it was very modern, right? And like the teacher was a really cool teacher in that, like, she would discuss the cultural things that are happening in society at the time that kind of informed the work that was being created. And there were there were a lot of cool kids in the class that understood things, understood the world. There were definitely some, I remember a couple kids in particular that were like extremely sheltered. I was probably the first black person that they'd really been around. You know what I'm saying? Like but it was more than that. Like they just were very resistant to perspectives outside of their own. They were very resistant to the idea that anybody who was from a group of people that had struggles in this country, that it wasn't those individuals' fault, and that maybe there were larger institutional issues. So long story short, like, my teacher who taught that class happened to be at the presentation when I read the piece. And this is relevant, I promise. But anyway, she
I'm interested, man. I can't wait for you to, I mean, just tell me what you got to tell me.
okay,
Absolutely.
okay. Yeah. So anyway, so after I read it, she said, like, she came up to me and was like, Marcus, you have to read that poem in class. And my first instinct was like, no, 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 thank you. Like, and she was like, why? Like, and I said, I was just like, you've heard the things that, like, some of the other students believe or don't want to believe. And I'm like, I really feel like it. And she said to me, like, and this honestly was the thing that encouraged me to, moving forward, get up and like read my work in front of people, beyond that point. But like, she said to me, like, look, those are the people that most need to hear it.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, you know, like, so I
I
went
need
to
to hear it.
class.
I mean, everybody needs to hear it. That's the greatest thing about
Yeah,
art, isn't it? That I mean, if you're not aware of it and you're confronted with it, your
right.
world opens up a little bit more.
And that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point I was coming to, you know, and because like I did go ahead and I read the poem, and um ironically, like the two students who, like I said, had been the most sheltered and had been the most resistant to ideas outside of their own, they both like came up to me afterwards and asked me for a copy of the poem, which like blew my mind. I'm not saying that it was like, I always, when I tell this story, I'm always like, I don't necessarily think that it was a total Disney ending and those guys are off, like, you know, helping kids in other continents right now or something. But I did see how art like is able to sometimes penetrate people's defenses in ways that conversation isn't. You know what I mean? Like we'd had discussions in class and you couldn't tell these guys anything, you know, but like through art, like they were able to be open. And coming back to Octavia Butler, I think that's my point. I think that like it's not, she's not strictly a for us by us author, because I think there is something intentional in her work that humanizes these characters. And when it really comes down to it, a lot of the injustice, a lot of the discrimination, the inequality and the iniquity in our society comes down to people not having their full humanity respected. And I
It's
think
interesting.
that
It's
she's
very
just,
interesting. I mean,
yeah.
I'm wondering, is it intentional or is that just the artist that she was? And then at the end of the day, society is better because of who she was. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, art, as being an artist, you know, it's hard to pull that string back and throw that arrow at the bullseye every time.
Right.
How can something be intentional when it comes from a place that's so undefinable? You know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 That's a really good question. And I mean, you know, I think it's one of those things where, you know, I mean, I guess we could look back her interviews and her writings, and, you know, biographies that people might have written about her. But it's like, it's one of the things where we might never 100% know. But
Yeah.
I definitely get the sense it was a part of who she was. I think because there's something just very truthful about her writing. And I mean, like, truthful in the sense of,
Honest. Yeah,
yeah,
I got
honest.
you.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it can't help but, you know, be just a product of who she was. And,
She
you know,
said the interview that I saw with Charlie Rose, she was desperate to be a writer. You know, she said that
yeah.
her life could have gone one of two ways. She was going to be a writer or she was going to die young. I mean, she had no other passions in her life. And, you know, I recognize that. There's like nothing else in the world that I want to do other than tell stories for people to read.
Right. Right.
You know, I mean, I imagine you're the same way. You want to tell stories, you want to paint, you want to, you know, you want to make things for people to enjoy and go, yes, that's why I'm alive. A sunset, a
Definitely.
beautiful old tree or whatever, you know, holding my children in my arms as babies. I hate my phone.
Oh,
But
no, yeah.
I mean, Toni Morrison, didn't she have a quote about not thinking that a black author should be writing white characters in their novels or something along those lines? Are you
She
familiar with that?
she might have. I don't know that particular quote. Um, so I mean, I can't speak to that quote in particular, but she might have. I mean, I could maybe.
So, what about a white author writing about black characters? Is that more acceptable, or is that still frowned upon?
Well, no, I mean, I think that it really comes down to respect, right? Like, I think I keep bringing up interviews I've been listening to. I was listening to an interview the other day with a TV and film writer, and that exact subject came up. You know, he was white, you know, and the hosts of the show that he was on were black, and they loved the show. I mean, the show is American Gods, you
Oh
know,
God,
and
great show. Yeah. Did you read the
yeah,
book? Great book too.
it's on my to read list. I have it on my shelf. I haven't read it
I
yet
love
though.
that guy. Actually, I don't love that guy. I love that novel. I've not read anything else by him that's gone in that direction for me. That's a beautiful piece of work, though.
Yeah, no, I hear nothing but great things. But yeah, like the writer was Michael Green, I believe, and he was speaking about that. Like he was speaking about the idea of him, you know, as a white man, you know, writing these stories. And like I thought what he said was just so on point. Because what he said was, well, I think the first question that really initiated it was he was asked about like, you know, like what made him want to venture out and tell stories beyond his own. And he said, he was like, look, I've had a pretty, you know, safe, kind of mundane life and experience. And he was basically like, I would be bored to death just telling my story over and over again. And in addition to that, like, you know, he was kind of joking about like how some of his other writer friends from a similar background, like, they just kept churning out like Reservoir Dog type stories. And you know, he was talking about the fact that you know, like looking at stories outside of his experiences really interested him, but he was aware that it's not something you just kind of shamble into and you just kind of take whatever surface understandings you have about other people. You know, like he brought a level of
Interest.
respect, and yeah, and a desire to learn, you know, from other people and actually just speak to other people. Because I think that's one of the biggest roadblocks in our society. Is I think that there's such a, I don't know, there's just so many defenses, you know, and I think a lot of times you know, people aren't always open to learning and experiencing, you know, other people's cultures. And you know, like that was his whole point. And his whole point was that like he's careful about telling these stories, and he's not just trying to be like, this is how I see you from my corner of the world, and I'm just moving these pieces around. And you know, I read all types of, you know, books, comics, stories, you know, whatever, from like all different types of writers. You know, definitely a lot of black writers, definitely, you know, white writers, everybody. And I think some of the portrayals of you know, black people and people of color, they ring, you know, less true than others when they sometimes when they come from outside of the group, you know. But there are a lot of good examples of writers, you know, who aren't people of color, who are able to tell a good story. Because at the end of the day, like, you know, again, just to bring it back to Octavia Butler, like her stories were just really good stories. They were really good stories. And the manner in which, and they were not good stories that were removed from race, or it wasn't like, oh, they were good because she didn't deal with race. She did deal with race, but she dealt with race in the way that I would say, you know, we experience it as black people, where it is, we're again, you know, we're people. And um the race and the racism, and all of those things kind of are coming at us from outside. And
Yeah.
so I think that I don't know, I just think that 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 is a, it's a gift, you know. It's a gift that that she was able to give to us. And I think that writers can tell all kinds of stories, but I just think we need to be responsible. And when I say responsible, I don't even necessarily mean it has to be some hallmark thing where, you know, everything has a warm glow to it. You know,
Hmm.
you can get into the ugliness of the world, of life. You know what I mean? You can get into the ugliness. Your characters don't have to be perfect, but it's just like, you know, there's a lot of assumptions that I think creators bring to stories. And you know, it shows sometimes when people don't get to know.
I'd be curious.
um
I wrote my first novel is Compounded Interest,
mhm,
and it takes place in Atlanta, and it takes place in Appalachia, and like three of my characters are of, you know, one's African and then one is African American.
mhm,
So I did it myself. I mean, I wrote
right,
both sides of the coin basically. Very poor white, very poor black, and I wanted to dig as deeply as I possibly could. I
right,
mean, obviously, it's very easy to imagine what a poor white person is because, you know, that's how I grew up. But I wanted to see also what a poor black person's life would have been like, poor as well.
right.
One's
Yeah,
a drug addict and one's, you know, been in prison for a long time. I mean, just maybe it's hard because I mean you have to be very careful. And I wasn't careful. I just wrote a story.
yeah. And you know what? Like, there's a balance, right? Because it's like you're still a creator, you're a writer. So you know, you you, you do have to really tell the story you want to tell. But when you think about like writing, and then obviously there's no critique of your story because I haven't read it, but I mean, I think just to the larger question and the larger idea that you posed about, you know, like white writers writing outside their experience, I think that for any artist, any creator, you do have to tell the story you want to tell. But that being said, we all do I mean, ideally, we all research something going into our story. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like
yeah, it's
to varying
impossible not
degrees.
to,
Yeah,
unless you just make it all up.
right. So it's what's always fascinating to me is sometimes when like what's I'm trying to think of an example. Even the idea of, well, like a lot of times, like for instance, you know, you've had like a lot of these silly controversies in recent years where, like the Hunger Games, right? Like there was a controversy where a lot of, you know, people were angry that the character of Rue was played by a black actress, even though in the books like she was described as a brown skinned person, but you know, people had all these issues with it and they just didn't believe that that could be the case. And like one of the things that struck me as kind of silly is the fact that people have no problem imagining these fantastical worlds, you know, where
As long as there's no black people in
yeah, but then it's like the
them.
idea that those people are black is like crazy to them. You know what I mean? Or like even in comic book movies, like people had a problem with Idris Elba being in Thor, and it's kind of like, you know. So I'm like, all
Do
right, so
you
you guys
do
are
you know
okay.
how Quentin Tarantino is potentially going to be directing a James Bond movie?
Well, I heard about a Star Trek movie. I didn't know
That's
about the
recent,
James Bond.
yeah.
No, I didn't
Like
know
a few
about that.
years ago, they talked about him in relationship to a Bond movie, and my fantasy was that
Okay.
he would cast, what's that dude's name that was in The Gunslinger?
Oh, Idris Elba. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted him as James Bond, and I wanted it to be a period piece in like the 60s or 70s. I thought that would have been
Oh,
brilliant. I
yeah.
thought that would have been
Yeah, that would be
brilliant.
good. No, that yeah, that dude he can act in anything. Like, yeah, I think he's amazing.
But The Gunslinger was
Um,
horrible, man. The Gunslinger was really, really bad,
it was.
and
I
it
heard
has nothing
about
to do
that.
with
And
him. It's just there was a
no,
bad.
no, you're absolutely. I heard the same thing. I was initially excited about it. The trailer looked cool and everything, but I did hear that it was terrible,
Oh
and
God, it was
I
so
was really
horrible.
sad about that
Did you read the
because I
book
love
by
that book.
chance? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
they just messed
yeah.
it up
I haven't
really,
read
really
them
bad.
all. I read the first three when I was in high school, and I didn't even realize until much later that he had just kept going. So I didn't realize that there were like seven. Were there seven of them?
I don't know. I've read up to like Song of Shannara, and I don't even know if that's how you pronounce the name. It was really not good. It was like a backstory or something. It was, oh, come on,
Oh,
buddy.
okay.
But yeah, I think
That's,
there's like seven or something like that. Just he wanted to write the longest fantasy series in the history of literature or something along those lines.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean I'm a big Stephen King fan. I mean Stephen King is he's a white writer who's written people outside of his experience. I think, you know, I think to varying degrees, you know, so, some things frustrate me a little bit, and but I love his books in general. Like even the ones where I was frustrated, I was like, oh, but it's still a good book, you know. And but yeah, you know, there's little things here and there. And I think he did well in certain cases. Um, regarding like writing outside of his experience. So
I mean, ultimately, Octavia Butler potentially didn't write outside her experiences. And like we said earlier, the world is a better place for it.
yeah, well, in some ways she did, because I think Parable specifically, and even Fledgling. You know, now that you mentioned that, and I started to answer that question, one thing I'm thinking about is definitely in Parable and in Fledgling, um, the even though the protagonists are black women, they're the group of people that are amongst in are kind of that they're amongst in their like their world are pretty diverse. And like, you know, there's white people there, there's non-white people of color, there's, you know, there's black people. So
Didn't you say
it's
that she was at
interesting
odds with them though, and not sure who she could trust and who the good ones and who the bad ones were?
to a certain extent, but in Fledgling, no, there's definitely people who are her people. Like, you know what I mean? Like they're um it's interesting because as the story progresses, we do have those questions, but there are some people who really prove to be her tried and true people, and those people happen to be of a variety of
That's interesting.
ethnicities. So I mean, in some ways that, yeah, maybe that goes back to what we were talking about Pasadena being a place that for her, you know, when she was growing up, that where there were all different types of people.
My favorite quotes about writing science fiction is you can't really write any farther than the last street light on your block that you could see. I mean, basically, you're writing within your sphere of knowledge, right? And you're writing about your experiences on this planet. You can't stretch too much beyond that, if at all. And I really think Octavia Butler is doing that. And I think she has wonderful language usage. I mean, her,
Oh yeah, yeah.
what is it called? The speech thing that she won the Hugo Award for. Beautiful language, beautiful.
Yeah.
The way she describes things, I'm sitting there going, oh my God, this is a really good writer.
Right.
And as a unique entity too, I cannot think of one other Black female science fiction author.
Yeah, no, there are definitely others, and I think that this time, I mean, now you have there's people like Nnedi Okorafor, who actually just had a series, one of her book series is what's his name? I think it's the Game of Thrones guy, George R. R. Martin is helping to you know, bring that to life in I think film form. So like it's kind of cool. We're actually at a cool moment where there are a lot of up and coming people who are telling stories. You know, in the past, you and I have talked about comics, and like, you know, so I definitely am a part of that world, and I'm aware of the comic world too. And there are like a lot of, you know, Black women who are telling stories in that vein
that's
too.
very true. I asked a few of them to be on the podcast when you know, I just caught that whole Twitter thing when I introduced myself to you, and there was a bunch of fantastic artists I wanted to
Oh
talk
yeah,
to.
you mean the Drawing While Black?
And
Yeah.
you're the only one that was kind enough to be on my show. The other ones didn't respond, but
Well, keep I mean, definitely keep reaching out, because I think there are a lot of really cool people out there, and like, yeah, that whole Drawing While Black hashtag was really a great one, and I think it
should have more of that stuff. I don't know how I ended up finding it though. It's not like I was looking for it. It's just like boom, all this great art sort of
Yeah.
flooding my Twitter. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, I feel like the weekend when it happened, it blew up. It was everywhere, and I think that speaks to the point that a lot of people miss, which is that, because, you know, whatever, like film publishers, a lot of times there's this idea that's like, oh, people don't really want to hear those stories, or blah blah blah, or they don't, you know, and it's like time and time again that's being proven wrong, you know, and it's like, because that
Publishers don't know anything. I mean, what we want as a reader or as an art viewer is a great experience.
right.
We don't care what color the person who created it is.
Yeah.
We don't care what the gender of the superhero is. You know, coming back or going around to Wonder Woman or something like that. We really don't care. What we want is a great experience. We want a beautiful painting. We want a magnificent poem. We want a breathtaking story, or whatever adjectives you want to throw at those things.
Yeah.
We want magnificence, and we don't care what color it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, look at Star Wars. I mean, you know, like, I remember there was this, when The Force Awakens was about to come out, there was kind of like a silly little hashtag that was like boycott Star Wars, because a small angry group of guys basically was like, I don't like that, you know, this new series is so quote unquote diverse, and that, you know, they've got heroes of color and women protagonists. It's like, I can't, that's not my Star Wars.
Dude's
And
a badass though, man. Do you see, what was it called, Defend the Block or something like that?
yeah. Oh, Attack the Block. I love that
Yeah.
film. Yeah. But that's my point. Like, these guys, it's funny because they, again, going back to Twitter, like they tried to voice this whole boycott Star Wars thing through Twitter, and the hashtag, you know, and like people of all types, you know, and then Force Awakens went on to break records as far as sales. So it's kind of like
Doesn't
that
matter.
angry, that angry little group of Trump voting nerds, like, you know, them staying home didn't stop the movie from being a success, because people want to see good stories, like you said. Like, they're not necessarily like, oh, I'm not going to see this story because the person doesn't look like me. They want to see good stories. So I think that we're in an exciting time, and I think that there is a movement to really allow, you know, other voices to be heard. And going back to our example of Octavia Butler, definitely Black women's voices. So I mean, I think that the time is now. I just think it's up to,
hopefully, you know, one of my biggest things that I worry about with this presidency, and the alt-right movement is that
Mm,
what we have will be erased and we'll go back to some horrible time where it's us versus each other,
right.
some death match of poor people or whatever. And it just makes me so sick to think that's maybe potentially on the horizon.
I look,
Completely.
I totally understand that, but it's funny because I'm very much a realist about just the type of things that you're speaking about. So I guess I feel kind of kind of strange just striking this note of optimism. But what I will say, because I remember, much like everybody, I'm sure we all remember where we were the day after the election day, and I remember specifically having a lot of conversations with people who were equally dismayed. And I remember one person in particular was like a fellow comic book artist said, like, look, I don't think we need to despair. There's going to be hard, and there's a lot of, like, there's going to be a lot of stuff that sucks that's going to be coming at us, but this is the ugly side of change. And
It's a great point.
yeah, and I was like, and I wasn't wasn't feeling super optimistic at that before he said that, but I was like, you know what, that's absolutely true. Because if you think about it, a lot of this concept of like wanting, quote unquote, my country back or making America great again, this is all stuff that started back in 2008, 2009, with people that were threatened partially, mostly by the idea of, like, a black president, but also just the fact that the world was changing even beyond President Obama. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's changes, there were changes for the better that you mentioned, that have been happening.
Mhm.
And I think, like, a lot of these people, like, you don't get to, I always say that it's not that people like Donald Trump or support him. They're just rooting for him because he's willing to spit venom at the people that they hate or that they fear, is a better way to put it, because the hate ultimately comes from fear. And so, like, I don't think anybody's for that guy. There's nothing there to be for, you know what I'm saying? Like, so
Mhm.
I think that now, at the same time, I always caution people, because there's that, I know you've probably heard people repeat the idea, like, oh, we just need to wait for the racists to die out. I always caution people against that, because that is like complacency, and it's also complacency in waiting for a thing that's not going to happen, because um
Well,
like,
my point. I think everybody's a racist. You're always going to like what you look like. I mean, you're going to look in the mirror and you're going to fall in love with people
right,
that
but
look like you. But
that's not racism to me. So like, there's a big difference between feeling good about yourself and hating people and excluding them
well, I was going
from
to
society.
continue saying,
Oh, go
as
ahead. I'm
far as
sorry.
that fear thing
Right.
goes, I mean, you hate what you fear, and you
Mm,
fear what you don't understand, and you don't understand what you don't talk to and get to know, and you know. These segregated communities in the middle of the country don't have the opportunity to talk to people that don't look like them. So they're going to
mm,
fear those people because that's the way media portrays them, and that's the way history has portrayed them, or maybe they feel guilty. You know what I mean? I mean, we talked about kindred. And one of the things Octavia Butler did in that book is write
mm,
about a realistic slave community. I mean, it was
right.
horrible. It was a nightmare. Granted,
Yeah,
the character
absolutely.
was
And
going through a nightmare, but I mean, that
right.
was a
And,
nightmare in
and
history that lasted for 400 years.
no, absolutely. And I mean, going to that point, in that book, yeah, she was able to really illuminate what life was like for the enslaved. But there's, yeah, again, I'm not gonna give away too much of the book, but like throughout the book, Dana, the main character, has a lot of interaction with both the son of the man who owns the plantation and the actual, slave owning guy. And that's complex in the way that she handles it. I mean, they're obviously not good dudes. It's not like
Yeah.
she's like, oh, he's a good guy, but at the same time, like, yes, elements of them being human beings, messed up as they may be, were there, and their fear, the underlying fear that was beneath it, the underlying fear that made them want to control these people, the underlying, and they're terrified of her, you know what I'm saying, being people who are from this world where it's just the way things are done to like keep Black people down, keep them from learning, keep them from
I mean, well,
attaining.
you're talking about like a livelihood too, right? I mean,
Yeah,
in terms of like the plantation owners, they were keeping people down so they could stay up.
right.
They were
Which
keeping.
I mean, I'm obviously not very sympathetic towards them
No,
about
of
that.
course not.
I'm like, it's like, all
Nobody's
right,
trying
too
to
bad,
do
dude.
that, but that's why
Yeah,
they
but
did it, right? I mean, there were poor
right.
white people there too. And what makes me so crazy to think about the Civil War is they made the poor white people fight their battle to keep slaves.
Hmm.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? This
No,
so
absolutely. And
they were horrid people, and they're still there, and they're still in charge of
oh
some of
yeah,
those
look, like fighting over the
states.
symbolism. Like, don't get me started. I mean, to me, it's funny when you see people, um, flying a Confederate flag next to the United States flag. I'm like, that's I don't know. Those two things don't go together. Like, you know what I mean? And it's like you're holding on to your weird illusion of I don't know of the world and this pride.
I mean, I wonder what kind of illusion they're holding on to, because I mean, that flag represents a loss, a big loss, not
Yep.
only in politics, in terms of economics, in terms of
Hmm.
whatever you want. I mean, that flag means you're a loser, and they
Right.
fly it like they're proud of it. I just don't understand whether or not it's stupidity, lack of education, lack of common sense. I mean, I really just don't understand it at all. And maybe that's the point. If I
Yeah.
understood it, I don't know if we'd be having this conversation, right? Because then
Right.
I wouldn't be I
Absolutely.
wouldn't be as
I'm glad you
perplexed.
can relate to it. I'm very glad you can relate to it. Yeah. No, but I don't think anyone should be able to because I think it's fear. It all comes down to fear. It comes down to anger, and it's like
I mean, back in the
in
beginning of the conversation, we talked about it's my wheat, my women, my whatever,
yeah,
and I got to keep you away because you're different,
right, right.
right?
Which it's a thing we need to move past. But going back to your point, I do think I do have I say hold on to your to your hope and don't necessarily let this moment that's how I look at it. I'm not letting this moment make me believe that we're 100% going to go back to the world that these guys want us to go back to. They're trying their best, and they got this guy in office. I think what's going to really tell the tale is if I mean obviously there's a lot of people of all types who are against this shift that is really trying to make itself happen. But I think that what it's going to come down to is what we do with this moment. If moving forward it's kind of like this is something that's going to be rejected and we're not going to try to repackage moving forward, or if it's going to be seen as like I don't know, a way to get some cheap votes, or not just for a president but for anybody, and I don't know. I think that I feel like sometimes when things get this ugly, I think it is the kick in the behind that you know good and decent people need in order to get moving. So
No, it's a very good point too. Have you heard of Kai Ashante Wilson?
sounds familiar, but I'm not 100% sure. Who is that?
He's a fantasy writer.
Okay.
I think he's done 2 novels already. I have one of them upstairs, but he's kind of doing the same thing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just, you know, out of the loop. But he's an African American dude writing
Mhm.
from, I think, New York City. So that makes me think, probably upper New York City area.
Okay.
But he writes fantasy, and it's brilliant. I mean, if I could send you a link
Yeah. No, I would love it. I would love it.
for this short story that's on tour right now.
Okay.
Thing is brilliant. It's called Lamentation of Their Women. It's about a couple who find voodoo paraphernalia in her dead aunt's apartment.
Hmm.
I just couldn't stop reading it. And it's
Wow.
genius way this guy writes too. And what amazes me, he doesn't have any social media presence at all. And people just tweet him out like crazy.
Oh wow. That's cool. Yeah. No, I definitely would be interested in reading that. That sounds.
Let me send it to you then. Where are we at as far as Octavia Butler is concerned? Do you think that we should be mentioning anything else?
I just really I encourage people to check out all of her work. I think I think Kindred is fascinating. I would assume that probably it's the one that is spoken about the most in a lot of senses, but it's all really good. There's Kindred, there's the Parable books, which I don't know, might be a little too close to home for people right now, but are really good. And um, I think just like check out her catalog. Like I mentioned earlier in the conversation when we first started talking about it. That I really just became familiar about her in just conversation, and then I was like, all right, let me go check it out, and I was like, I was hooked. I was in, from that point. So I think that like for people, just check her out. Check out Kindred, check out some of these other books, and I think you'll really enjoy it.
Was she already did she already pass when you found out about her?
It was no, because this was, I want to say, what are we, it's 2017 now. I feel like it was like '05 or possibly '04. So I mean,
So right
obviously
before she died then.
yeah, it was pretty close. It was pretty close. Yeah. Yeah.
As an author, man, that scares the crap out of me. It's like the end of your life is when people start talking about your stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Think
No,
about
it's
Shakespeare. I mean, he wasn't really Shakespeare until over the 19th century, basically.
yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. Man, this is a great conversation, dude. You're just a real smart guy, and I really thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh yeah, no problem, man. It's my pleasure.